Hi, my name is Savannah Whitehurst Blystone, and my research project is going to be about Harriet Jacobs, specifically about her time as an enslaved woman down in North Carolina, and about the subsequent book that she wrote entitled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So to give you some overview on Harriet Jacobs and kind of why I kind of picked her as a research topic. So Jacobs is actually the first woman to ever publish a runaway slave narrative. There's actually only three runaway slave narratives published by women. And so I think that's quite extraordinary, and then with her being the only one. And so I think that adds some very valuable insight into the plight that women faced while being enslaved, particularly to the sexualization that enslaved women faced. She had quite an extraordinary tale that she told, from her enslavement to how she escaped slavery. So she spent her entire enslaved life in Edenton, North Carolina, how she escaped slavery, and then she went from Philadelphia to New York, where she was actually almost captured, and sent back down to slavery, and then eventually ending up in Boston. Her escape from slavery was in no way, shape, or form easy. She actually spent 7 years of it in hiding, before she was able to make her escape possible. It really shows you how strong of will and dedication it took for her to make that jump to escape. So it really shows that kind of passion and dogged determination for it. Another overview, or kind of like reason why I wanted to research this, is because there is the connection for my own like local history. So I am from Gates County, North Carolina, which is only about 30 minutes northwest of Edenton, North Carolina. So there is that local connection to it. I never knew of Harriet Jacobs until I was well into adulthood. It was not until I became a teacher and began learning about teaching and about different ways to bring in local history that I even heard of Harriet Jacobs. And at first I was quite shocked and almost angry that I was denied learning about this as a young child, because I thought, what an amazing story to learn and to be told, especially for people in our region, because it's such an amazing connection to local history, and what a great way to learn about this topic, and to also be connected to the local area. And so from that, I've kind of delved into it, and I thought this was an amazing story that deserves more looking into it. Now, within the scope of this course, because Harriet Jacobs had such a kind of expansive life. She was born in 1813 and died in 1897. And so with the scope of this course, we were only supposed to research between a certain period of time. I'm only researching her life as an enslaved woman. So she escaped slavery in 1842. That's when she was able to leave the Edenton area and make her way to Philadelphia. So for the sake of this research project, I am only looking at that period of her life as an enslaved woman here in Edenton, North Carolina. So with that in mind, let's look at Edenton. So Edenton is quite an interesting area. And so this picture right off here to the side is a picture that I took. This is the historic Edenton Courthouse, which was built in 1767. So this is a building that Harriet Jacobs got to see growing up in Edenton. This is the second town in North Carolina. It's also the state's first ever colonial capital. This was a port city. It was of great economic importance to the region, though in this time frame in the 19th century, their economic importance had begun to wane, in particular with the embargoes and stuff that was put in place during Madison's administration with the War of 1812 and stuff. But another neat thing was Edenton was a huge part of the Maritime Underground Railroad, which is something that a lot of people don't really know about. We learn about like the Underground Railroad and that kind of march towards freedom that a lot of enslaved people took, but they don't realize that the coastal regions of the South also had a different type of route that many people took to try to get towards freedom, and that was using the waterways to get towards freedom as well, and that became known as the Maritime Underground Railroad. Now, to kind of give you an idea as far as the population, so the town of Edenton itself, which is a part of Chowan County, at one point, Chowan County was one of the largest counties in North Carolina, but because so many of the surrounding counties that now make up the area were chipped out of Chowan County. Chowan County is now, I'm pretty sure this is still correct, the smallest geographical county in the state of North Carolina. So the population of Edenton has remained pretty stagnant from about 1790 to 1850, remaining at about consistently 1,500 people, and that includes their free and enslaved population. Meanwhile, the county of Chowan itself was a pretty large county considering its size and its population. So in the 1850 census, you had about close to getting to almost 3,000 whites. You had over 3,000 enslaved people, 3,637 to be exact, and you had a little over 100 freed people of color residing in the county altogether. Now, this is something that I also wanted to talk about before really jumping into Harriet Jacobs and her life. And this is some of the black codes that North Carolina had. So really, since black codes have been around, so since the institution of slavery had been around, North Carolina had been passing black codes. But with the Nat Turner slave insurrection, North Carolina, of course, got very antsy, as of course a lot of southern states did. So in 1830, North Carolina passed some all-sweeping legislation. This became known as the Slaves and Free Persons of Color, an Act Concerning Slaves and Free Persons of Color. Yes, I know, it's a very specific title. So what this was they kind of went through all of their legislation, and they kind of lumped together all previous legislation concerning enslaved and free people of color, all of their black codes. They put them together just to make sure that they were all kind of loaded together in one spot, and they also passed new sweeping legislation, particularly when it related to the gathering of people of color and the emancipation of slaves. This was extremely comprehensive. It was a list of black codes that's going to really affect all facets of life for both enslaved people and free people of color. Now, a couple of the things that I really wanted to highlight was what they really wanted to do was the state of North Carolina really wanted to make it so that the state had no free people, no emancipated slaves living in the state. So one of the things they did is they really tried to push out, and they said all emancipated slaves had 90 days to get out. They said failure to leave the state or return to the state, or any return, to the state would result in arrest of the freed slave. If found guilty for violating the terms of his or her emancipation, the freed slave could be ordered or be sold back into slavery. So that was extremely interesting. So there was a lot of misconfusion on this, and it's still kind of ambiguous. So a lot of people did not know, did this law mean any slaves that were like emancipated slaves that were already living, or did that only concern any emancipated slaves from this point forward? It was very ambiguous in that place. North Carolina General Assembly kind of meant it that way. They were really trying to scare all free people of color out of the state. It was kind of a terror tactic in that way. So they wanted anybody to get out. Another thing that they did is they also passed this law that I thought was quite interesting, stating any free Negro or person of color who may be a resident of the state was prohibited from leaving the state for more than 90 days. Basically stating that that person could have their residency revoked, they could no longer return to the state of North Carolina, and doing so could result in being returned back to the state of slavery, having any property confiscated. Again, it was all about trying to get the only people of color they wanted in the state of North Carolina were enslaved people. So I wanted you to keep this in mind, particularly when you're looking at some of the people that are involved in Harriet's life. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the main people that are going to be involved in Harriet's life. And let's get to that. So here we have Harriet Jacobs. Now you'll notice that underneath that I have AKA, or also known as Linda Brent. And that's because Harriet Jacobs, when she does publish her enslaved narrative, she publishes it under a pseudonym. And her pseudonym is Linda Brent. And she does that for every person involved in this book. So the main people, or not the main people, all the people in the book she has fake names for. So that's what she kind of operates with. This is one of the reasons why, we'll talk a little bit later, it took so long for this book to be given and her narrative to be given the kind of respect and the consideration that it was due, because a lot of people thought that this was actually a work of fiction for many, many years because of the fact that it was under pseudonym and not under her actual name. Okay, so anyways, Harriet Jacobs, as I mentioned earlier, she was born in 1813. She actually does not escape the institution of slavery until 1842. She is born to two enslaved parents. She's for the most part orphaned at a very young age. So her mother dies when she's 6 years old. Her father dies when she's about 13 years old. And she describes her childhood as very happy and carefree. She actually did not even realize she was enslaved until she was 6 years old. She had very good mistresses, and she grew up in a very happy, stable home at that time. And this is something we'll talk about in a couple of slides in the future, you'll see. It's at 11 years old that she's willed to her former mistress's 3-year-old niece. And this is kind of that turning point in her life where everything truly changes for her. It's never going to be the same. So her former mistress, she was extremely close to, her whole family was extremely close to. They had very good working relationships with, and it's at this point that everything changes. Now, her new mistress is a very young girl, as you can see. So this 3-year-old niece is now her master at 11 years of age. So this image over here is Harriet Jacobs. It's the only known likeness of her that exists, and we'll talk about this in a little bit as well. At the age of 15 is where Harriet is going to begin to truly have a new facet of her life kind of taken over, and she's going to experience sexual harassment and daily prolonged sexual predatory behavior at the hands of her mistress's father. And this is something that she'll have to go through every day of her life until she chooses to flee slavery. So now we're going to talk about Harriet Jacobs' grandmother. Now, in the book, she is known as Grandmother, or the townspeople call her Aunt Martha, but again, that's just a pseudonym. In reality, her grandmother is really Molly Horniblow. She is an enslaved woman, and the story is that she was a young child born into slavery, but she was actually granted freedom. Her mother her grandmother as a young child with her mother and siblings were granted slavery at a very young age, only to be sold back into slavery, and her grandmother will eventually earn her freedom yet again. She bore 9 children as a enslaved woman. She ended up raising her 2 grandchildren, which is Harriet and her younger brother, John, who in the book is called William. And she'll even raise her 2 great-grandchildren, which are Harriet's children. And then she, of course, is a wet nurse for her mistress's children. And so one of the anecdotes that Harriet tells in her book, one of the anecdotes that Harriet tells in her books, or in the book, is that one of her grandmother's children was not even weaned till she was like 3 or 4 years of age because her grandmother was busy being a wet nurse. So that's one of the things. So her grandmother is beloved by all the residents in Edenton for her baking skills. And it's so much so that when a lot of these black codes were coming down from the North Carolina General Assembly, such as these ones trying to force freed men and women of color out of the state, the residents of Edenton completely turned a blind eye. They did not want Molly Hornblow leaving Edenton because they loved how she baked, how she sold preserves and stuff. So they were totally fine with her being a freed woman of color living in Edenton. Despite practically raising Harriet and being extremely close to her, Harriet did not confide in her grandmother about the sexual harassment and the sexual predatory behavior that she was suffering, really up until the day that she ran away. Her grandmother did try several times to buy her daughter's freedom, to no avail. And then in the end, her grandmother is responsible for hiding her granddaughter for 6 years and 11 months, and again, helping her granddaughter escape north to freedom. Now we meet Dr. James Norcom, or in the book he is known as Dr. Flint. This is the man who became Harriet's tormentor. He is a doctor in Edenton. He is very well respected. He is very wealthy. He is a landholder, slaveholder, plantation owner. He was a U.S. Army surgeon. He served in the War of 1812. He was married twice, a father of several children, both in wedlock with his wives and out of wedlock. Harriet Jacobs mentions in her book that she knew of 11 children that he had with different enslaved women. So she knew very well that if she ever did succumb to his sexual advances, what lay await for her. And that's something that she absolutely did not want. And according to her, she told of many different incidences of very harsh and abusive behavior that he exhibited towards her and towards other enslaved people in this book. And it was quite horrific things that he did. At one point, when he found out that she was pregnant with her second child, he cut all the hair from her head. He beat her a couple different times in anger when she rebuked his sexual advances. Other times, if he did not like the way his food was prepared, he made his enslaved people eat like dogs. He beat them. He was not a nice man. We meet his second wife, also known as Mrs. Flynn. She is Mrs. Norcom. She is 16 years old when she marries Dr. Norcom, who is 32 years of age. And she never liked Harriet. Even as a young girl, she did not like her. She was always very suspicious of her, and she was always trying to encourage her husband to sell Harriet. And Dr. Norcom would never sell Harriet. He always said that he did not have the legal right to sell Harriet because she is actually his daughter's property, and he doesn't have the legal right to sell his daughter's property. And him and his wife were very kind of shifty. So something else that, for example, that they did is the former mistress of both Harriet and the grandmother had promised the grandmother freedom upon her death. And that is something that the grandmother brought up, and Norcom absolutely refused it. He was like, oh, can't do it. I'm sorry. It's actually, I just can't do it. And at one point, Harriet's grandmother had even been trying to save up money to buy freedom, and she lent $300 to the former mistress, of which she had written proof that she had lent $300 to her former mistress, and that the former mistress said that she owed her this amount of money, and that money was used to buy a silver candlestick. Dr. Norcom said, "Oh, I can't pay you this money back because the state, it's insolvent. We don't have the money to, give you this money back. So sorry, I can't do it." And he wouldn't even let her have the candlestick back because nope, can't do it. Absolutely cannot do it. One of the other main features of incidences in the life of a slave girl is Mr. Sands, who is in reality Samuel Treadwell Sawyer. He is actually a future U.S. congressman, and this is somebody who Harriet describes in great detail as somebody that she specifically chose to take into her bed, not because she loved him or had any great sort of affection for him, but because he was more powerful in the community, and she knew that by taking up with him, he would be able to protect her from Dr. Nordcombe's advances. In reality, it came down to Nordcombe finally gave her an ultimate decision. He said, "I am building a cabin separate from the house. That way you can no longer say that there's an excuse for you not to sleep with me. So when this cabin is built, I'm going to put you in this cabin and I expect you to become my mistress." And so at this point, Harriet Jacobs was extremely confused and nervous. She didn't know what to do, and she really thought she was at her wit's end. And so she decided to take up her own lover, and she ended up falling, with child during that. And she said that this was her way of kind of taking control over her own body and her own destiny. And she said that she got a lot of power and satisfaction when that cabin was finally built and Norcombe told her that she needed to report to the cabin. And she said, "I'm not going to report to the cabin because I'm with child." And so that was her way to take control of her destiny. She didn't want to become lovers with this man, but this was her decision in the end, and that was her way of becoming her ownership of her body. So what was life like in bondage for Harriet Jacobs? So slavery at Edenton is very interesting, and it did allow for certain freedoms that is something that you don't naturally think of when you think of the institution of slavery. So I have this book here because if you've never heard of this book or if you're interested in studying slavery, I highly recommend this book. David Selesky is an amazing author. I've had the chance to meet him and attend several lectures with him. And so The Waterman's Song, it is an amazing book. And so what he puts forth in this book is he argues that slavery in these maritime regions, such as North Carolina, did allow for a little bit more freedom. So many enslaved men and women were able to kind of work outside of their bondage, and this allowed them to, in many cases, buy their freedom. So like in the Waterman's Song, he kind of details a story of some people like Moses Grandy. And this is even evidenced by people like Harriet Jacobs' grandmother. So she was able to buy her freedom in a way because she saved up money. She was put up on auction block, but she had conspired with another white woman, and she gave that woman money to buy her off of the auction block. And she would not have been able to do that if she had not been able to kind of work outside of, at the end of the day, after things had closed down, she was able to make biscuits and crackers in the off hours to sell on the side. And this is something that happened a lot of times in these maritime regions. There was a lot of work that could happen outside of hours, and a lot of enslaved people could get kind of like sold on the side, or they could sell their labor outside of things and save up money and buy their freedom and do things. Harriet Jacobs' father was a very skilled carpenter, and he participated in a lot of this type of labor as well before he passed away. Harriet Jacobs herself, she was taught to read and write. She knew basic mathematics. And then some of the other freedoms that she had that is not something that you necessarily think of when you think of the institution of slavery, but it's something that stood out to me when I was reading her narrative, was that after giving birth to her children, she was allowed to stay in her freed grandmother's cabin for an extended period of time. When she was first sold or given to her new mistress, the 3-year-old girl, and her father had passed away, she was, very lost and alone, and she was allowed to stay in her freed grandmother's cabin for a little bit of time. So there was a lot of this movement around in the community of Edenton where enslaved people tended to have these abilities to kind of move amongst themselves to different plantations. And she did mention how there were some plantations where these private cabins could be built and relationships could be formed between different enslaved people at plantations, and you could kind of intermarry between them. That's something that you don't necessarily think of when you think of the typical institution of slavery. Now, I'm not trying to say that slavery was in any means different, better here in Edenton compared to anywhere else, and there is no way that slavery in itself is better, because just the institution of slavery in itself is bad. But also, let's look at the sexual violence that the enslaved people faced, especially Harriet Jacobs. So one thing that also comes to mind is, compared to the other slave narratives that we read of and we think of, the sexual violence that Harriet Jacobs describes, it also shows that there's different forms of sexual violence that enslaved women could face and have to deal with on a daily basis. So Harriet Jacobs faced long-term sexual harassment and grooming from a very early age. So at 15 years old, a 47-year-old man is beginning to harass her. She says it began kind of slow, whispering foul words in her ear, and then it grew to this constantness, like just nagging. Dr. Norcom was constantly reminding Jacobs that she was his property. She would not be able to escape his advances. He was constantly following her. He made her do things like feed him. He would write her dirty notes. Once he learned, of course, that she knew how to read. And then if she acted like she couldn't read, he would read them aloud to her and then explain them to her in graphic detail. He really took delight in his discomfort, or in her discomfort. He then decides that he's going to start making his young daughter sleep in his room, and then as a result of that, he's going to make Jacob sleep in the room with him. That way she could be there to take care of the young daughter. This was going to be his way to make sure that Jacobs was in the room with him. So he's doing these things to try to make Jacob stay close to him. So this is a lot different from like the scenes of sexual like abuse and violence that we see against women in other slave narratives, such as like what's done in Sullivan Northrup's 12 Years a Slave. So this is a lot different. But this is still sexual violence. This is still prolonged harassment, and it weighs down, and it really, you hear it, and you hear the despair in Harriet's voice when you're reading this in her narrative, how just even this type of stuff, it's not outright rape and violence, but it's still wearing and grating on her very soul and spirit, and you can feel it in her words in this book, and it really hits you deep. And it's only then when this type of act that you see Mrs. Norcom finally deciding to step in. It's then when Dr. Norcom decides he's going to try to build a private cabin, and it's only then that Jacobs, who's been trying to hold on to her purity and her honor for so long, decides that there's nothing else she can do but take a white man as a lover to try to take some sort of ownership over her body, because that is the best thing she can do to counteract Norcom's advances. So Jacobs decides to flee when, after she does have a relationship with Mr. Sands, who is in reality the future Congressman Sawyer, she actually gives birth to two children. She'll have a son and daughter by Mr. Sawyer. So at this point, Dr. Norcom presents her with a pretty familiar ultimatum. In it, he says, you're going to move into that cabin he had built, and she's going to end up becoming his lover, or he's going to send her to work on the plantation of his son from his first marriage. He really thinks that Jacobs is going to choose the life of becoming his mistress, and she says, no, I'm going to go work on the plantation. It's only when she's working there for a little bit that they realize she's not, bowing down, that they didn't decide, we're going to bring your children in. And she knows that if the children get sent to the plantation, the likelihood of them being sold off somewhere is much higher. Then that's when she has to do something, and that something is running away. That's when she realizes, I have to do something much more drastic. So she flees in the middle of the night. What we have over here to the side, this is the eventual reward poster, our runaway slave advertisement that Dr. Norcom will put out for her, and we'll talk about that in a second. So where does Jacob go? So the night of her escape, she'll actually go to her grandmother's home. She doesn't go to her grandmother, though. She'll go to somebody who lives with her grandmother, who gives her some items. She's able to see her children one last time. They're sleeping in bed. And from there, she actually goes to a friend's cabin where she hides out for a couple of weeks. So for those couple of weeks, they're really watching her grandmother's house. They're hiding, stalking her grandmother for the most part, because that's where they really thought she was going to go. She gets bit by a snake while she's hiding out kind of at the friend's cabin and in the swamp. It's only then that the grandmother finds out what has happened. A white sympathizer and friend of her grandmother's has, found out some things and offers to hide Harriet Jacobs. And so it's at that point that Harriet goes to this woman's house where she's hidden in this small storage room. And she is there for several months. It's during this time that she has to watch things like she watches her children and her brother be imprisoned for a little bit, that type of thing. Eventually from that, she'll go to her grandmother's attic crawl space where she is there for years. And then from there, she will hop her boat ride to Philadelphia. And then she will be a runaway slave up north. So these are some runaway slave advertisements that Dr. Norcom had put out. There's two, and this is from an amazing database that North Carolina has. It's through the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. It's an amazing resource. It's awesome. I highly recommend it. But one is for this enslaved person named Derry, and he's only offering $25 for Derry. But the other one is $100 reward. I always like to point that out. This is something I would always show my students. But this is the reward that he is offering to find Harriet. And so it says, $100 reward will be given for the apprehension and delivery of my servant girl, Harriet. She is a light mulatto, 21 years of age, about 5'4" high, of thick and corpulent hair, having on her head a thick covering of black hair that curls naturally, which can be easily combed straight. She speaks easily and fluently, and has an agreeable carriage and address. Being a good seamstress, she has been accustomed to dress well, and has a variety of very fine clothes made in the prevailing fashion, and will probably appear, if abroad, tricked out in gay and fashionable finery. As this girl absconded from the plantation of my own without any known cause or provocation, it is probable she designs to transport herself to the north. The above reward, with all responsible charges, will be given for apprehending her and securing her in any prison or jail within the United States. All persons are hereby forewarned against harboring or entertaining her, or being in any way instrumental in her escape, under the most rigorous penalties of the law. So you can get a lot of information about, one, how Harriet looks. And so you think back to that picture of Harriet at the very beginning of the presentation, and you look at this description of her. It's obvious that Harriet has white ancestry there. She most likely can pass as a white person in this type of description here. And he is offering $100 reward for her, so you can tell Norcom really wants her back, especially if you're comparing it to this description of in this reward for this other enslaved person that he would like to get back, who is Derry. And so he posts that picture, or sorry, he posts that reward in 1835 for Harriet, and this other image I have is from 1830, and it is for $25 for an enslaved man named Derry, and it says $25 will be given for the apprehension and confinement of Derry, who ran away from the subscriber about 5 months ago. Derry, generally known by the carpenter, is a brown mulatto of small stature and thin visage, about 5'8" or 9 inches high. He speaks quickly and rather boastingly, and I believe has lost some of his 4 teeth. He has been seen several times by persons of color near Nixington and Pasquotank County, in the neighborhoods of which he has relations, by whom he is probably harbored and kept out. So that just gives you an idea of kind of the person Norcom is. So these are some efforts that Norcom has taken to capture Jacobs. As I mentioned, at one point, he has imprisoned her brother, her aunt, and even her 2 children. Her aunt, who is actually, she mentions her name as Aunt Nancy in the book, but we know she uses pseudonyms. I have not, in my research, been able to find out what her aunt's real name is. But it is her mom's twin sister. I know that much. Was only detained for a short while because she was like the head enslaved woman. She was like the house runner. And so Mrs. Norcom, after a couple weeks, just is like, no, I need her back. But her brother and her 2 young children stayed in the jail in Edenton for 2 months. Her grandmother was followed. Her home was searched several different times. This was before Jacobs actually went into hiding in the crawl space, and her mail was even read a couple of times. This is because Jacobs was quite clever. At one point, she started sending letters, and she got people that she knew that could send letters from up north down into Edenton to try to throw Norcom off her trail. And so she would send them, like she might write a letter to her grandma that made it seem like she was from, you know, she was in Boston. Or at one point she sent a letter that made it look like she was in Canada. So at one point, there was violence against her family. Norcom, he still owned several of her family members. He threatened them. He threatened to have them sold. And at one point, how it in the end it actually works out really neat. So her brothers and young children ended up being bought by her lover, because he was just like, once they get out of jail, I'm going to sell them to a slave trader. That's really going to get Harriet back, because she's going to hear about this and come back. And so the slave trader had actually been talking with Mr. Sawyer, who they had kind of worked something out. And so the slave trader bought them and then immediately sold them to Sawyer without Norcom's knowledge. And so Norcom was very angry about all of that. So Norcom ended up spending a considerable amount of money, not just on, you know, advertisements, promising rewards. At one point, he spent $500 traveling to New York to go look for Harriet. He actually goes to New York a couple of different times. He paid off informants, all trying to look for Jacobs, but he never gets to her. So Harriet, as I mentioned, in 1842, after 6 years and 11 months in hiding, she finally is able to get on a boat in Edenton Harbor and get safely to Philadelphia, up onto freed soil. She's considered a fugitive slave. She still has to counteract with things like the Fugitive Slave Act, so she's going to constantly be looking over her shoulder. But she is free. And she is working towards making sure her children can get free as well. So her children are bought by their father, and she is, trying to get her father to emancipate them. But what in the end happens is her narrative is an amazing piece of work because it, as I mentioned, it gives insight into the plight that enslaved women face in terms of how they lacked control over their destinies, control over their bodies, control over their children. Her grandmother, the story that she kind of interweaves of her grandmother losing her children, constantly trying to work to buy her children's freedom and never being able to get there, is extremely sad. So her grandmother gave birth to 9 children in slavery, and in the end she watched all of her children but one die before her, which was extremely heartbreaking. And so, as I mentioned too earlier, this book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, was actually originally thought to be a work of fiction, and it's not until the 1980s that a professor from Peace University, Dr. Jean Fagan Yellen, worked, and she was actually able to prove that this book was not a work of fiction, it was actually a narrative. And so she set about researching to prove that this was real people mentioned in this book. And so this book has become extremely influential and needs to have much more recognition for that. Now, one of the things that I found super interesting was that the town of Edenton has really embraced the Harriet Jacobs connection, which to me was surprising because a lot of places in the South still can tend to hold on to a much more romanticized version of slavery, especially if sometimes the connotation with slave narratives can cast a negative light on some old family names such as Nordcombe and Sawyer within the Edenton area. So the fact that they kind of latched on to that and they're embracing that, I have found extremely positive. So this is something that you can do in Edenton today. So Edenton has a walking tour that you can take. It is a self-paced one, but they also do have guided ones that you can take. Since I have found out about Harriet Jacobs, I have done the self-paced one several different times. And one of the things that I have always found to be super interesting is just how close everything is together. So for example, if you were looking over here at this map, 4, 5, and 6 are the items that I am always just so amazed about. Well, first let me say, the only 2 buildings that are left standing actually from Harriet Jacobs' time are the old courthouse and really the jail. Those are the things that really are there that kind of touched Harriet's life, if that makes sense. So the courthouse and the jail are things that were there and actually matter to Harriet. So she played in front of the courthouse. The jail housed her brother, her aunt, and her children at some point when she was in hiding. So it was all there and she was super close to it. But anyways, what I was going to say is 4, 5, and 6. So 4 is the site of Dr. Norcombe's house. Number 5, right here, is the site of her lover. So that's Mr. Sawyer, Samuel Sawyer's house. And then 6 was the site of her grandmother's house where she was in hiding for 6 years and 11 months. So to me, that's what's amazing about it, is the fact that for 6 years and 11 months, she was just right under his nose. And so that's, to me, one of the things that just gives me goosebumps. So some of the other things too, Edenton, they're there, you can read about their tours and stuff that they have. They also have kind of a guided tour about the Maritime Underground Railroad, of which they also talk about Harriet Jacobs as well. And then lastly, this is kind of my references and sources I used. I looked at a lot of different stuff. The main source that I constantly kept going back to was Incidences in the Life of a Slave Girl. And then Documenting the American South is a database, or collection, I should say, of primary source documents put together by University of North Carolina. And so they did a lot of the hard work for me because they have a whole collection of stuff with Harriet Jacobs. So So luckily I could just go there, and they have mined a lot of the collection. So all I had to do was kind of click, and then the stuff is just there. So between Harriet Jacobs' incidences in the life of a slave girl and documenting the American South, they were the two most amazing things for my research. Those were absolutely spectacular with that. So this is Harriet Jacobs and incidences in the life of a slave girl. Thank you so much for listening and paying attention.